Welcome to this month's Ask an Editor. We're going to be talking about how you can hook your readers, and I'll get started.
So my name is Eva Barrows, and I am a developmental editor for fiction and nonfiction books. And I'm also a story development coach that kind of helps authors get started and keep going with their writing projects. And I also do publication management for newsletters.
And my name is Lila. I copy edit fiction. I beta read specific fiction genres, and I proofread screenplays. Okay, so what is a story hook? A story hook has the job of compelling your reader to keep reading after that first line, the first few pages, or the first chapter. Those first few words or pages or sentences need to grab your reader's attention and get them to want to keep reading, to turn the page, and not to stop after that first chapter. Good hooks make readers care. So begin telling the story where the conflict starts instead of wasting time like getting things going and leading up to it. That way your readers are just like, they're like in it, they're excited from the beginning, they're ready to go. And make sure that it's organic, done organically. And just remember that you have to pay attention to lots of things because your story hook introduces your characters, the conflict, and your protagonist's main goal or motivation. So your first chapter does a lot, and so that's why it's so important. Oops. Oh, there we go.
So we're going to talk about where you can hook your readers in your story. So just to let you know kind of how long a hook is in effect. So the hook can start at, it's going to start at the beginning of the story and then go all the way to through the first quarter of your story or the first quarter of your novel. And it launches into the middle 2 quarters of your story. This length is sufficient for the reader to become totally invested in finishing the story. The hook covers the story's opening, the inciting incident, which is what kicks off the action, and then it goes all the way to the first pivotal story beat that changes the protagonist's course. And then hook your readers in the story's first line. So the first line of your story is an essential place to capture the reader's attention as they experience the story action, and you get to know them as your story guide. And that would be either the narrator or a main character. And then some ways to grab attention in the first line would be showing the main character in their ordinary world before things change. And then you can also show your character reacting to something new, or there could be a narrative commentary about what's happening, and that's filtered through the narrator's attitude or their viewpoint. And so I think a couple of my favorite slides are just kind of looking at what good first line hooks are. So from A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, it starts off with, Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. So these are technically 2 sentences, but that's the starting lines of the story. And it's introducing Marley. And so the reader is like, wow, this person's dead. So, what does that have to do about this, with this story? Why are we talking about this person? And then it's also through a narrator. It seems like it's not a character so much telling the story, but kind of someone, that's above the story telling us, the reader, what's happening. And then from Charlotte's Web by E.B. White, the first line is, "Where's Papa going with that axe?" said Fern to her mother. as they were setting the table for breakfast. So just to let you know, like a lot of context can come from what's on the cover of a book. So I believe that the cover of this book, it has a girl with a pig, and you kind of just think farm. so so there's no mention of farm here, but when you kind of think of it that way, the axe seems to be, in that world because there's, it's a tool used on the farm for many different reasons. So there's the, you know, readers asking the question, what also, what is this? What's going on with this axe? And then you're introduced to three people. You're introduced to Papa, Fern, and then her mother. And then just within the context of the set, it being like a kitchen or breakfast time. So you get all of that just in this one sentence. But I was also going to have a note on dialogue. So just in general, think you don't really want to start your story with just dialogue where it's like a back and forth between characters without setting up the context. So in this case, it was okay because you kind of know where you are. You're on a farm, you're in a house, and there's all this detail after the dialogue. But if it's just a back and forth between characters, your readers might feel lost. They're not really connected yet with what's happening. So just be careful of using dialogue.
Yeah, it would definitely be one of those like talking heads situations, and you can't imagine the room they're in, what they're doing, or anything. Yeah,
Mhm.
I agree.
And then The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. As Gregor Samsa awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. So this is a kind of a normal thing where, he's waking up in the morning, but he finds out he's an insect. So that definitely is a hook for your reader. They're like, just like, wow, someone woke up one day and they were a bug. How did that happen? so so you're introduced to Gregor. It seems like it's being told by a narrator. And then the story problem is right there. He's a bug. That's a problem.
Very interesting one. I haven't read that one yet. So, and then language wise, with all three of these, you'll see that the sentences are, I mean, this last one's slightly more complex, but the sentences are all basically very simple. It's like simple language, and it just catches you, not with its complexity, but just with how interesting it is and what it makes you wonder.
So going beyond the first line, you want to hook readers in the first few pages, and then maybe you don't have such a, wonderful first line itself, but the first paragraph really needs to, get the reader to pay attention. And then going into the first pages, they have a lot of work to do in needing to orient the reader into the story world. And they're going to be establishing tone, style, setting, and mood, as well as laying the groundwork to meet your genre expectations. So if you were writing a murder mystery, a murder would happen pretty soon, pretty quickly in the beginning of the story. And that's going to hook the reader. They're like, oh, there's a murder. What happened? I want to keep reading. And then in a romance, the two lovers would meet at some point, like pretty quickly, so that we know, there's just going to be some tension, romantic tension happening pretty quickly. Um, and then the opening pages introduce characters and they put the story in motion. And they must explain why readers need to meet the characters at this point in time. And this would be right before or during the same time when the protagonist's world changes. So I was just thinking, like Charlotte's Web, like we don't meet Fern when she was a newborn baby because that's not where the story is starting. We're meeting her later on in life, and it's about to happen. And then you want to hook your readers definitely by the first chapter ending. The first chapter immerses the reader in the story world and ramps up to the protagonist's story long quest. So, to hook readers, you need to make it clear who the story is about and what they want to achieve. So, we want to know it's about Fern. um, and then introduce the story problem that the protagonist must solve and give them a taste of what they will have to do in order to obtain it. And then you're going to infuse emotions and sensory detail on the page so that readers can feel what the protagonist is experiencing. So really, a reader must they need to feel invested and put into the world. Otherwise, it's just kind of like things are happening and they're not really engaged with it. So that's where the sensory detail and the emotions of what the characters are going through is really going to help. And then the chapter ending needs to launch the reader into the next chapter and motivate them to keep reading. So sometimes chapters will feel like the end. So you don't want it to feel like the end. You want it to feel like, and then, something else is happening next. And then how to hook readers. It's like, oh, this is mine. Okay. So there's two techniques to engaging the reader and setting up the story. So this is kind of like a popular way to start a story is called in medias res or in medias res. So it's kind of like things are already happening. And I was just thinking like a big example of this is like if you go to see like a Marvel movie and there's a big battle happening like right away at the beginning. So people that are watching this might feel kind of like, what's happening? All this action is happening. Why is it happening? So you would feel kind of, I would say not so grounded, but you have a lot of questions, like why is this happening? So it's basically dropping the story into the world and they're immediately witnessing how characters are reacting. And then this can be, that Marvel movie is a extreme example, but then there's quieter ways to kind of just put the reader right into what's happening. And then another way to start a story would be to open with a character moment. So you're disrupting the protagonist's daily routine. Readers will see how the character deals with the unexpected challenges. The character's strengths and weaknesses will be tested while sketching in their worldview. And I think going back to the metamorphosis, like that's, he's just waking up in the morning, but he's a bug. so that's kind of what that translates to. And then you're going to hook your reader with dynamic characters and then just talking a little bit about the character voice. So give your protagonist a compelling voice created through their attitude or their take on life. So that if they're just kind of not a vanilla person, they kind of have their thoughts and things and they want to express that. And then make sure readers will want to spend time with your character or the narrator as they guide us through the story. And this is, you might hear about likable characters. So for me, that's like someone that a reader can root for because they empathize with them. And then the empathy comes through, what they're thinking, what they're saying, what they're doing, and how they're reacting. They might not be, you might not want to be best friends with them, but you think they're interesting enough to see what the story is about. And then, so then another thing about dynamic characters is looking at their actions and their goals. So readers need to know what the protagonist's goal is. You need to know what it is they're trying to get. What do they want? Why do they want it? And what's inside that they have to overcome in order to get it. And then if readers know what the protagonist wants and their struggles to get it, emotional weight is created and that deepens your investment in the character. And then as the reader sees them striving and feels them having consequences, they're gonna wonder, what's gonna happen next, and they're gonna want to stick around.
And then the other side of this is just making sure that your first chapter is really strong and polished. writing wise or language wise on the line level. So you want your writing to be tight, which means you're going to be making it clearer and like just providing more clarity while maintaining the essential meaning of what you were wanting to say, which then makes your sentences more engaging and feel more immediate for the reader. So instead of, this is an extreme example, and it's not a great first sentence, but it could be anywhere, in the first few pages. Due to the fact that she was extremely tired after having stayed up all night working on her manuscript, Mary decided that it would probably be best if she didn't attend the meeting that was scheduled to take place the following morning. That's like really clunky, way too wordy, right? And of course, that's, if you add up enough of those types of sentences, reader could definitely feel like, you know what, I'm just going to set this book aside. I don't want to continue. But instead, you can pare it down. So, exhausted from working on her manuscript all night, Mary skipped the next morning's meeting. So much easier. And it's fine. Like, often when we write our first draft, it might be more full of the first kind of sentence. And then you just kind of pare things down as you're revising. And that's very normal. And another great thing to make sure you're doing is using strong, specific verbs. This gets rid of the need for using a lot of adverbs, which aren't horrible or evil, but it's good to like kind of pare it down. A strong, specific verb is way more impactful than an adverb and a weak verb. So, and it helps readers more easily imagine what's happening in their heads. So instead of, he was walking slowly across the room and was looking around nervously, as if he was expecting something to happen. You could try. He crept through the room, glancing around as if expecting something to strike. So instead of walking slowly, he creeps, which, it kind of gives a better visual in your head. Glancing around instead of just looking around. Glancing, are kind of like quicker looks, so that can kind of also be more specific, give you a better idea. And then you don't need nervously, because obviously if he's creeping around and he's like looking back and forth, of course he's nervous. And then, something to strike instead of something to happen. Again, it's just more powerful, and that just, it's more engaging, more entertaining. And then always just remember, especially in that first chapter, of course, you want everything to be polished and like correct, nice grammar and good spelling. But what's even more important is just consistency. So readers just want to know that this is going to be a great, high quality story, and this author took the time and and care to be really professional in how they wrote this first chapter. And that's going to mean, that your reader is going to want to keep going. Even if maybe they're not quite as interested as maybe this isn't the type of book they might normally pick up, but if it looks polished and it's interesting enough, that could lead them on to the next few pages, which is a good thing. So even though, okay and okay, both of those are correct, just try to be consistent throughout the manuscript. Yes, in American English, we more often see MR period instead of Mr. spelled out or whatever, or we see gray with an A, yes, but really it doesn't matter as long as you're consistent throughout the manuscript. So if you're a bit of a perfectionist and you worry about that type of thing, the most important thing is just doing it the same way every time, and you really don't need to worry so much. All readers want is to know that you put the time and effort in, that you're professional and you care about your work, and that it's easy to read and interesting, of course. So you want to make sure, especially if you're sending your manuscript to agents and editors, you want to make sure that it looks professional. And that just means you've got a consistent, easy to read font like Times New Roman, that your for agents and editors anyway, that your manuscript is double spaced, 1-inch margins. It's in a doc or docx format or a PDF. Sometimes they'll request that you have consistent line spacing and margins. And even if you're self-publishing, it might not be double spaced, but everything just looks consistent and professional. And that really you might not think about it that way, but it really does impact the way the reader takes in your story. Also, you usually want to avoid a bunch of all caps or so many italicized words that it gets difficult or annoying to read. Make sure your chapter headings are consistent in format, and then are you using numbers, or are you spelling out the numbers, or are you using titles? It just all needs to look uniform. So here's an example. The one on the left obviously is going to be more difficult to read. It's not impossible, but the font is a little off. The line spacing varies, which just looks very unprofessional. And it's going to depend, obviously, in graphic novels or comics or children's books. There might be words that are colored, or more words that are in all caps, or more exclamation marks. But in general, in a typical adult novel, you're going to want less of that. So the one on the right is something that's what it would look like when you send it to an editor or an agent. And it just is so much easier to read. Okay, so now we're going to talk about what takes readers off course.
So using a lot of backstory and summary could be, detrimental to your story hook. So generally, you don't want to start with summary. Summary helps move a story that's already in progress. And then to start a story, focus on writing an intriguing active scene instead of using the summary. And then be careful not to fill the first pages with backstory. Readers will visualize and use the sensory hints that you give them to create their own concept of your characters. If backstory is needed, you can incorporate it, kind of very sparingly on a need-to-know basis, and that just keeps from bogging down the story's start and slowing the momentum.
And even in fiction, an author can kind of go off on a tangent. I see this most often when the author kind of has, in addition to telling a story, the whole point for them is more to teach the reader a lesson, or get a point across, or get the reader thinking about a certain topic or issue, which is great. That's always a great thing about that fiction can do. But sometimes authors are a little heavy-handed on that, and they'll kind of go off on a tangent, and that really takes, especially if it's in the first chapter, that can really take the readers off course. So just remember, if it's not relevant now for your plot, then save it for later, or just cut it all together. Readers like to kind of infer information and themes, and they don't like to just have it thrown in their face. So sometimes just cutting it is the best thing to do. If you are really attached to something that you probably should cut, or you should figure out some other way, just save it and put it in another doc, and then read through it without and see how it sounds. And later you can always try and incorporate that later into the manuscript or into the story. And then with point of view, you want to make sure you're very careful with point of view in the first chapter. Don't create reading whiplash by setting up a character's or narrator's point of view and then suddenly switching to another one. You can switch point of views responsibly by doing it at scene endings, or between scenes, between chapters. But first, you kind of want to, you really want to ground your reader in that current point of view, that current perspective, before you start doing that. Sure, authors do it sometimes. You would have to be very careful doing it during that first chapter or first couple of chapters. So just consistency is key, like always. Head hopping scatters your reader's focus. And oh, and then I put a little note, if you want to know more about point of view, we did an Ask an Editor session in January that was all about point of view. So that could be helpful to watch. So here's an example. Eva watched Mark from across the cafe, wondering if he'd noticed her new haircut. She felt silly for caring, but the way he smiled always made her stomach flip. Mark sipped his coffee and tried not to stare. He liked her haircut. It made her look confident. He hoped she didn't think he was being too obvious. Eva gave him a little wave. Great, she had noticed him staring. So we start that first paragraph, excuse me, that first paragraph is Eva's point of view. And all of a sudden we're in Mark's point of view. No scene break, no chapter break. And it's just kind of sudden and jarring for the reader, because we were expecting to get get everything that Ava's thinking and from her perspective, but then we're thrown into Mark's. And then if we go back into Ava and back into Mark, or into a waitress, then that would really make it really difficult. So just wait a little bit and do it between scenes and chapters.
And then hard to follow story sequences would be flashbacks and flash forwards. And it's kind of the same thing as the point of view moving around. It's a back and forth across the timeline, which can be reader whiplash. This can also be done. So if you want to have a flashback or a flash forward, that can be done responsibly and incrementally so as not to confuse the reader. And then just make sure to ground the reader in whatever the current time is, and then long enough for them to get settled in the story. And then you can flash back if you need to, or flash forward if you need to, but just make sure that grounding is there. So I think the through line is that you want to make sure not to confuse the reader, and then you'll just look at that when you're kind of going back through your draft.
Same thing with tense. So past tense, present, it can be jarring. So like Eva said, the through line is just ground them first and do it at appropriate times. So instead of Maya walked through the forest, listening to the crunch of the leaves. The wind was cold on her cheeks. She freezes when she hears a branch snap behind her and spun around. That should sound pretty off to you. So here's obviously the better one, which I know you all probably could fix easily. But Maya walks through the forest, listening to the crunch of the leaves. The wind is cold on her cheeks. She freezes when she hears a branch snap behind her and spins around. So you just had to choose one or the other. I chose present because it just felt more immediate. It's more like for this type of story, but either would have been fine. And then, of course, you can switch tenses between chapters. This usually accompanies a switch of point of view as well. And I've seen this a lot in suspense and thriller. I actually really enjoy it. But it has to be done deliberately and carefully, and has to be very obvious and easy for the readers to figure out. So you want to really give a good signal to the readers that that's what's going to be happening. So like in Gone Girl, Nick's chapters are in present tense, giving like a real-time account of the story's events. And then Amy's diary is, those entries are in past tense, and it kind of gives backstory to their relationship, which then helps explain more about the real-time events. So yeah, it's really obvious though. It's easy for the reader to follow. And that's the way you want to do it. Now we'll give you some self-editing tips for hooking your readers.
So when you're doing your revisions of your story, so just just to let you know that it's best to just write your story, just write your draft, and then circle back and revise the hook, at the end once everything's down. And you're going to be trying to make sure that the story hook connects with the rest of the story, which is always in flux as you write. So it's good to like not be too concerned about it as you're writing it. Like hey, I need this to happen that leads up to the inciting incident, and then I need this to happen when it leads up to the first pivotal plot point. And then just make sure all that content is there. And so you're not worrying about nailing your hook in the first draft, because everything's going to change when you're working on it. And then just really think about finalizing the hook once you're happy with how your story is progressing. And then just to remember, once you've hooked your reader or your potential agent or publisher, make sure that all of your story is just as good as the hook, because they're going to want to read everything else. So the what caliber needs to be consistent.
You can watch last month's Ask an Editor session, because we gave a lot more detailed information on handling repetition, ensuring consistency, creating authentic characters to follow your readers' expectations. And then another tip is just to, I think I said this last session too, but regularly step away from your manuscript during the revision process, whether that's for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months, because then you can come back to it with fresh eyes and you'll notice a lot more. And then, of course, double check the spelling, grammar, and punctuation, but remember that your main goal is to make the experience smooth for your readers and not necessarily just win at grammar. How professionals can help.
So if you decide to work with a developmental editor or a story coach, these professionals can help the author make sure the start of the story feeds into the rest of the story. And then just starting from page 1, they can help you develop the character, their, what's driving them, what it is they want to obtain, and their internal desires that are driving the story. And then the developmental editor can help you increase conflict and build tension that excites the reader and keeps them, invested in what's happening.
Beta readers and critique groups can be very helpful. And the cool thing about your hook or your first chapter or two is that should be fairly easy to get people to read for you or to read to them, like say in your critique group, because it's so short. So all you're going to do is you're going to give it to them or read it to them and ask them, okay, were you hooked? Would you keep reading? Why or why not? So yeah, it's just a great resource for getting people's opinions on whether they would continue to want to read. Honest opinions, hopefully. And then line editors will help you with word choice, rhythm and flow of your sentences, the readability, and they could give you ideas on how to make that first sentence or paragraph really pack a punch with the readers. And then copy editors check your grammar, incorrect punctuation, repetition, clarity, and consistency. So yeah, it's just really important to make that first chapter the best it can be. And then like Eva said, then continue on and make sure the whole manuscript is that way. Because I have read, I have gotten manuscripts from a few people, and then I'll see the first chapter, I'll be like, oh, this is amazing. And then I'll realize, oh, we got a lot of work to do, so it's fine. But just do your best to make sure that the whole manuscript or the first chapter represents the quality of the whole manuscript. And our next workshop is going to be in June, and the topic is what writing format targets my audience best. So if you're not sure, should this be a short story? Should this be I don't know, an article? Should this be a memoir? This might help you out. And you can register at the links there.